For 100 years, no flame had held in the East Tower. Alchemists, royal botanists, every learned man the court could summon had tried and failed. The night they finally mockingly sent for the herb girl, she stepped inside, and the last dead ember stirred. Linnea was only an herb girl, her knowledge of root and leaf dismissed as village superstition by the learned men of the capital. The Royal College had laughed at her and sent her away with a letter of censure. She was the final, desperate, laughable resort for a tower no expert had been able to save. But what the capital called superstition was real knowledge. A lifetime with her hands in the earth had taught her to feel what was alone and what was dying. The spark under dry bark, the roots still breathing in a withered stem. And the moment she crossed the threshold, she understood what no alchemist had grasped. That flame was not a mechanism to be repaired. It was alive, and it was going out the way something goes out when it has been alone for far too long. She did not treat it like a broken ward to be fixed. She knelt beside the dying flame the way she would tend a living thing. And from the deepest shadows of the tower, the master no one had laid eyes on in 100 years watched her do the one thing every expert had been too proud to try to. That night, for the first time in a century, the flame in the East Tower did not go out. If you believe the one the world dismissed can rekindle what no expert could, type flame below and let me tell you what happened next. To understand how she got there, you need to know about the dust. It was a special kind of dust, the kind that settled on forgotten things. It coated the spines of the book Sable was paid a pittance to restore. It filmed the windows of the cramped workshop her uncle allowed her, and it seemed to settle in her own soul, making her feel gray and overlooked. Her name was Sable, and she was an artist of the forgotten. With nimble fingers and a patience that bordered on prayer, she could take a waterlogged manuscript, its pages fused into a brick of ancient grief, and coax it back to life. She could regild a faded letter, stitch a broken spine with waxed linen thread, and smooth a tear in vellum until it was a barely there scar. Her world was the scent of old paper, the dry perfume of leather, and the sharp tang of binding glue. Her uncle, Mr. Alistair Finch, saw none of the art. He saw only the commodity. He had taken her in after her parents' passing, not from kindness, but from a miser's sense of opportunity. Sable was a tool, an asset that could be leased out or, as it turned out, sold outright. The day the papers were signed, the air was thick with the promise of rain. A carriage, black as a raven's wing, and pulled by two horses that seemed carved from night itself, stood before their immodest townhouse. A man in a severe dark livery stood at the door, his face impassive, a leather satchel in his hand. Sable was called into her uncle's study. He did not look at her. His eyes were fixed on the pouch of gold coins the agent had placed on his desk. The clink of them settling was the sound of her future being sealed. "You will go to Blackwood Manor," her uncle said, his voice clipped. "You are now indentured to Lord Valerius. You will do as he commands, without question." Blackwood Manor. The name fell into the room like a block of ice. Stories clung to that place like ivy, dark and strangling. They said no birds sang in its woods. They said the fires in its hearths gave no warmth. And they said its master, Lord Valerius, had not been seen in daylight for a generation. The agent's eyes, pale and colorless, flickered over her. He seemed to be assessing the quality of a piece of livestock. "Her tools and materials are packed?" "Everything," her uncle confirmed, gesturing to a small, sturdy trunk by the door. "She is proficient." It was the closest thing to a compliment he had ever given her, and it was part of a sales pitch. Sable said nothing. A storm of protest raged inside her, a hurricane of fear and betrayal, but her face remained a calm mask. To show weakness in front of these men was to give them another weapon to use against her. She met the agent's gaze, her own dark eyes steady. It was a small act of defiance, the only one available to her. The agent gave a curt nod. He collected the indenture papers, now bearing Lord Valerius's stark, angular signature, and tucked them into his satchel. The transaction was complete. The carriage ride was a journey into deepening twilight, both outside the window and within her heart. The city gave way to countryside, which in turn bled into a wild, untamed forest that seemed to swallow the road. The trees grew thick and ancient, their branches clawing at the sky. A profound chill seeped through the carriage walls, a cold that had nothing to do with the weather. When they finally arrived, the manor rose from the mist like a jagged peak. It was a masterpiece of Gothic architecture, all sharp angles and soaring towers that pierced the bruised purple of the evening sky. Gargoyles watched from the eaves, their stone faces twisted in silent screams. It was not a house, it was a mausoleum. She was led through a cavernous entry hall where suits of armor stood like silent sentinels, and the only sound was the echo of their footsteps on the black and white marble floor. The air was frigid, still as a tomb, and smelled of stone, beeswax, and something else. Something metallic and ancient, like old coins or dried roses. They did not take her to the servants' quarters. Instead, she was led down a long, portrait-lined corridor to a vast library. The sight of it, even in her fear, made her breath catch. It was a cathedral of books. 2 stories of shelves soared into the darkness, crammed with volumes of every shape and size. A rolling ladder leaned against one wall, a silent invitation to the heights. But it was a wounded cathedral. Dust lay thick on everything. Cobwebs draped the chandeliers like funeral shrouds, and a scent of decay, of damp paper and slow ruin, hung in the air. In the center of the room, seated in a high-backed chair carved from obsidian dark wood, was him, Lord Valerius. He was unnaturally still, a statue draped in fine black velvet. His hair was the color of a moonless night, streaked with silver at the temples, and his face was a study in aristocratic beauty, all sharp planes and elegant lines. But it was a frozen beauty. His skin was pale as marble, and his expression was one of absolute, soul-deep boredom. Then he lifted his head, and his eyes found hers. They were not black, as the story said. They were the color of deepest crimson, like garnets held up to a flame, and they held an intelligence so old and weary, it felt like a physical weight. The temperature in the room dropped several more degrees. The candles on a nearby candelabra flickered violently, though there was no draft. His voice, when it came, was like smoke and old wine, a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in her bones. He did not speak to her, but to the agent who stood beside her. "This is the one, the restorer?" "Yes, my lord, as specified, the best my inquiries could find." Lord Valerius's gaze swept over Sable, dismissive and brief. It was a look she knew well, the look of a man appraising an object. "She seems unremarkable." The word stung more than a slap. Unremarkable. It was the story of her life. The agent, eager to prove the value of his purchase, gestured to a large table where a single object lay under a velvet cloth. "A test, my lord, if you will." Lord Valerius gave a languid, almost imperceptible nod. The agent pulled back the cloth. Beneath it lay a book that was less a book and more a tragedy. It was a folio-sized volume, its leather binding split and warped. The pages were a solid block of mildewed paper, stained and cockled from what must have been complete immersion in water. It looked utterly beyond saving. It was the most challenging piece Sable had ever seen. "Can you fix this?" The Lord's voice was laced with a cynical amusement, as if he already knew the answer. Sable stepped forward, her fear momentarily forgotten, replaced by a professional focus. She ran her fingers lightly over the ruined cover, her touch as gentle as a sigh. She smelled the decay, assessed the damage with a practiced eye. Her mind was already working, cataloging the steps: humidification chamber, careful separation of the fused leaves, mold treatment, pressing, mending. She looked up, not at the agent, but directly at the lord of the manor. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet but clear. "Fix? No. Nothing can be made as it was, but I can save it. I can make it whole again. I can make it so its story can be read." For the first time, a flicker of something other than boredom crossed his features, a glint of interest in those crimson depths. He had expected a simple yes or no, a servant's reply. She had given him a craftsman's truth. "Show me," he commanded, his voice a soft, dangerous whisper. Her trunk was brought in. She unpacked her tools with methodical grace. Bone folders, scalpels, fine bristled brushes, pots of paste she had mixed herself. The household staff, who had materialized like ghosts in the doorways, watched in silence. The agent watched with a smug certainty. Lord Valerius watched with an unnerving, predatory stillness. Sable ignored them all. She entered her sanctuary, the quiet space of intense focus where only the work existed. She began with the most delicate of operations, attempting to separate the first page from the solidified block. It was a process that required humidity, patience, and a surgeon's touch. Any mistake would turn the ancient paper to pulp. Hours passed. The only sounds were the whisper of her tools and the ticking of a grandfather clock in the hall, a sound as slow and relentless as time itself. The candles burned low, their light seeming to lean in toward her work. The shadows in the room deepened, and some of them seemed to move with a life of their own, pooling at their master's feet like loyal hounds. Finally, with a soft sigh of parting fibers, the first page came free. It was fragile, stained, but intact. The ink, though faded, was legible. Sable held it up, a delicate membrane of history saved from oblivion. A sharp intake of breath came from the high-backed chair. Lord Valerius rose. He moved with a liquid, silent grace that was utterly inhuman. In 2 heartbeats, he was beside her, his presence a vortex of cold and power. He did not look at her. His entire being was focused on the fragile page in her hand. His crimson eyes scanned the archaic script. A muscle feathered in his jaw. For a fleeting instant, an emotion too profound and ancient to name washed over his face. It was a look of raw, unshielded grief. Then the mask of cold indifference slammed back into place. He turned his gaze on her, and for the first time, he truly saw her. He saw not an unremarkable servant, but the skilled hands, the unwavering focus, the quiet reverence she held for the past. He saw the artist. He turned to the agent. His voice was no longer bored. It was as sharp and cold as a shard of obsidian. The papers. The agent, startled, fumbled in his satchel and produced the indenture contract. He held it out. "My lord?" Lord Valerius took the document. He did not glance at it. His crimson eyes were locked on Sable. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, he tore the thick parchment in half, and then in half again, the sound ripping through the library's silence. He let the pieces flutter from his fingers to the floor like dead leaves. "She is not my property," he stated, his voice ringing with absolute authority. "She is my guest. She will be given the scribe's suite in the West Wing. Her meals will be brought to her. She will have unrestricted access to this library, and she will answer to no one but me." He then did something that stunned every soul in the room into frozen silence. He bent his head in a gesture that was almost, impossibly, a bow, a mark of respect. Then he looked at the agent, his eyes glowing with a dangerous light. "You are dismissed. Leave my lands before the moon is fully risen. Do not return." The agent scurried away like a frightened rat. The staff vanished back into the shadows they had emerged from. Sable was left alone with the ancient lord and the pieces of her broken bondage at her feet. She was no longer a possession. She was something else entirely. And that, she suspected, was a far more dangerous thing to be. The scribe's suite was not a room, it was an apartment. It had a sitting room with a small marble fireplace, a bedroom with a bed so large she felt lost in it, and a private balcony that overlooked a garden of pale, night-blooming flowers. The furniture was elegant but draped in dust cloths, as if it had been waiting for an occupant for a century. A young maid, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe, showed her the rooms and explained that her meals would be left outside the door on a trolley. "Lord Valerius, he has not had a guest in my lifetime," the girl whispered, "or my mother's." Sable spent the first few days in a state of suspended disbelief. She worked in the library, a vast and silent kingdom that she now shared with its king. He was always there, sometimes reading in his chair by the fire, sometimes standing in the high galleries, a silhouette against the tall, arched windows. He never spoke to her, but she felt his eyes on her constantly. It was not a leering gaze, but one of intense, unnerving scrutiny. The shadows were his companions. They clung to him, stretching and thinning as he moved, sometimes detaching from him completely to glide along a wall or pool in a corner. She learned not to be startled when a patch of darkness in her peripheral vision would coalesce and then dissolve. They were a part of him, an extension of his will. She worked tirelessly on the ruined book, slowly, painstakingly separating each page. It was a journal written in a fine, elegant hand. The language was archaic, the ink faded, but as she saved each page, a story began to emerge. A story of love, of art, and of a vibrant life lived centuries ago. 1 week after her arrival, as she was carefully pressing a newly dried page, Lord Valerius finally spoke to her again. He was suddenly beside her, having crossed the length of the library without making a sound. The ever-present chill that accompanied him washed over her skin. "You are skilled," he said. It was not a compliment, it was a statement of fact. "Your uncle did not know what he possessed. He never cared to look," Sable replied simply, not taking her eyes from her work. "Why do you do this?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "This tedious work. What drives such patience?" She paused, considering her answer. She finally looked up at him. His crimson eyes were hypnotic, drawing you in, promising secrets and sorrows. "Every book has a voice," she said, "a soul. It holds the thoughts and dreams of someone who is gone. To let it crumble to dust is to let them die a second time. I work so that they might speak again." His stillness was profound. He looked at the page she had just saved, at the graceful script, and the mask of indifference slipped again. That devastating grief, the one she had seen on the first night, washed over his features. "Her name was Iona," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "She was a painter and a scholar. She wrote this journal." He reached out, his long, pale fingers hovering over the page, not daring to touch it. "An accident. A fire. The wing of the house where she kept her studio was destroyed. I thought everything was lost. This was all I could salvage from the ruins." And suddenly, Sable understood. This wasn't about collecting a rare artifact. This was an act of mourning, a desperate attempt to reclaim a ghost. He hadn't hired a restorer. He had sought a necromancer, someone who could raise a voice from the dead. He led her that night to a sealed section of the library. Behind a heavy oak door was a smaller, circular room. In the center of it, on pedestals draped in black velvet, were dozens of other items: charred canvases, melted lumps of silver that had once been jewelry, and more books, all bearing the same horrific damage as the journal. It was a shrine to a lost love. "Can you save them?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice held not a command, but a plea. It was the sound of a heart breaking across centuries. "Can you give me back her voice?" Sable looked not at the ruined objects, but at the ancient, powerful being beside her. She saw past the fearsome lord, the creature a legend, the one the world called the Vampire King. She saw a man hollowed out by a grief so vast it had frozen him in time. Her own small pains, her uncle's cruelty, her lonely life, seemed insignificant in the face of his monumental sorrow. And her heart, which had been so carefully guarded, went out to him. "I will do everything in my power," she said softly. "I will make them speak again." "Would you have stayed when you learned the truth? When you realized you weren't just an employee, but a tool to mend a wound hundreds of years old? Tell me in the comments, and if you are not subscribed yet, join this family." Her agreement changed everything. The silent observation became a quiet companionship. The library became their shared world, a pocket of time separate from the one that spun on outside the manor's gates. Their days fell into a rhythm. She would work at the long table, surrounded by her tools and the fragile ghosts of Iona's life. He would sit in his chair by the fire, a book open in his lap. Though he rarely seemed to turn the pages, he was watching her, always watching. He began to speak to her, not often but with purpose. He would tell her about the passages she was restoring. "She wrote that in Florence," when he would say, his voice soft with memory. "She was describing the light on the Arno at dawn." Or, "This was a treatise on the use of lapis lazuli. She ground her own pigments. Her hands were always stained with blue." Through her work and his words, Iona came to life in the quiet library. Sable felt she knew this woman from another age. Her passion, her intellect, her love for the man who now mourned her. And in sharing these memories, Lord Valerius began to change. The impenetrable wall of ice around him began to show the faintest of cracks. The oppressive cold that surrounded him lessened, just a degree or two. Sometimes a ghost of a smile would touch his lips as he recounted a memory. One evening, a fierce storm raged outside, rattling the leaded glass windows. A draft snaked through the library, and Sable shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. Without a word, Valerius rose. One of his shadows detached from the floor, stretched impossibly long and thin, and flowed into the crack beneath a window, sealing the draft. The chill vanished. Sable stared, astonished. He simply returned to his chair and picked Mohent's book, as if his shadow rearranging itself to serve her comfort was the most natural thing in the world. Another night she worked late, her eyes burning with fatigue. She must have dozed off, her head pillowed on her arms. She awoke with a start to find a thick cashmere blanket draped over her shoulders and a single perfect white rose in a silver bud vase on the corner of her table. He was nowhere to be seen. The small, silent gestures of care touched her more than any grand pronouncement could have. He was seeing her, not just her skill, but her. He saw her fatigue, her chill, her dedication. In this dark, forgotten manor, tended to by a creature of the night, Sable felt more seen than she ever had in the bright, bustling world of men. Her own feelings began to shift and deepen. The fear she initially felt had long since evaporated, replaced by a profound empathy. That empathy was now blossoming into something warmer, something more dangerous. She found herself watching him, noticing the way the firelight caught the silver in his hair, the elegant line of his hand as he rested it on the arm of his chair, the deep well of sadness that never truly left his eyes. The turning point came on a cold, clear night when the moon was a silver disk in the sky. She had finally finished restoring the first journal. The pages were clean and stable, the script legible, the spine newly stitched and strong. She had rebound it in dark blue leather, just a shade lighter than midnight. She brought it to him, her heart thudding in her chest. She held it out. "It is done." He took the book from her, his cool fingers brushing against hers. A jolt, like lightning on a summer night, shot up her arm. It was the first time they had touched. His skin was not the deathly cold she had imagined, but cool and smooth, like river stones. He opened the journal, his touch infinitely gentle. He read a page, then another. His throat worked, and he had to close his eyes for a long moment. He was not just reading words, he was hearing a voice he thought was lost to him forever. "Thank you," he breathed, the words laden with the weight of centuries. He looked up at her, and his crimson eyes were bright with unshed tears. "No one has given me a gift of this magnitude in my entire existence." "It was her gift," Sable said softly. "I only unwrapped it." He reached out and with the back of his fingers traced the line of her jaw. His touch was feather light, yet it burned a trail on her skin. The air between them grew thick, charged with unspoken emotions. His gaze dropped to her lips. The world seemed to shrink to the space between them, silent and sacred. "Sable," he whispered her name, and it sounded like a prayer. He leaned in, and she knew he was going to kiss her. She wanted him to. She leaned in to meet him. But at the last moment, he pulled back, a look of conflict and pain on his face. "I cannot," he said, his voice strained. "It is not right. You are a creature of warmth and light. I am what I am." He stood abruptly and retreated to the shadows of the gallery, leaving her standing in the candlelight, her skin tingling where he had touched her, her heart aching with a strange mix of disappointment and a dawning, terrifying hope. The fragile peace of their isolated world was shattered by the arrival of a carriage. It was not the discreet, black coach of the manor, but a gaudy, ostentatious thing, emblazoned with a coat of arms she didn't recognize. Valerius stiffened, his head snapping up from the book he was reading. A low growl, more animal than human, rumbled in his chest. The shadows in the library writhed and deepened. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice flat and cold, the warmth of the past weeks gone, as if it had never been. He swept from the room, a king going to face an unwelcome petitioner. Sable, however, was not one to hide. She followed him at a distance, her soft-soled shoes making no sound on the marble floors. She watched from the shadows of the great hall as the butler admitted two men. One was her uncle. His face was a mixture of greed and fear. The other was a portly, florid man in ridiculously fine clothes, a nobleman by the name of Baron von Hesse. "Lord Valerius!" the Baron boomed, his voice echoing in the vast space. "I have come on a matter of property." "You have come to my home uninvited, Baron," Valerius replied, his voice dangerously soft. "That is a mistake." Her uncle, emboldened by the Baron's presence, stepped forward. "It's about the girl, Sable. There was a misunderstanding in our contract. Her indenture was for a term of service, not a permanent transfer. The Baron has made me a most generous offer for the remainder of her term. It was a lie, a transparent, greedy ploy. Her uncle had seen his mistake, not in selling a human being, but in underpricing her. He had come back with a richer buyer to try and steal her back. Baron von Hesse puffed out his chest. I am a collector of rarities, my lord. A book-mender of her reputed skill is a fine addition. I am prepared to pay you double what you paid this person. He waved a dismissive hand at her uncle. Valerius was perfectly still, but the air around him crackled with contained fury. The candles in the hall flickered and died, plunging the hall into a twilight gloom illuminated only by the stormy light from the high windows. There is no contract, Valerius said, his voice a low threat. I destroyed it. The woman you speak of is under my protection. She is not for sale. Protection, the Baron scoffed. Come now, we are men of the world. Everything has a price. Name yours. It was then that Sable stepped out of the shadows. I am not property, she said, her voice clear and steady, ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. My life and my skills are my own. They cannot be bought or sold by any of you. Her uncle's face went pale with shock and anger. The Baron looked at her as if a piece of furniture had just spoken. But Valerius's eyes found hers, and in them she saw a blaze of fierce, protective pride. You see, Baron, Valerius said, a cruel smile touching his lips. The lady has a voice of her own. He took a step forward, and the shadows swirled around his feet. You have insulted my guest. You have trespassed in my home, and you have tried to claim what is mine to protect. You will leave now. The Baron, arrogant and foolish, drew a small, ornate pistol from his coat. I will not be ordered from this place by a reclusive degenerate. I will have the girl. The world seemed to move in slow motion. The Baron raised the pistol. Her uncle cowered, and Valerius vanished. He did not move fast. He was simply there one moment, and the next he was in front of the Baron, his hand clamped around the man's wrist. There was a sickening crunch of bone. The pistol clattered to the floor. The Baron screamed, a high, thin sound of agony. Valerius's eyes were glowing, two burning crimson coals in the gloom. His fangs, long and sharp, were descended, gleaming in the faint light. The mask was gone. This was the predator. This was the ancient power the world whispered of in fear. This was the Vampire King. She is not a thing to be had, he snarled, his voice a guttural echo of the ages. He lifted the whimpering Baron off his feet with one hand, his strength terrifying and absolute. She is the mistress of this house, and you will address her as such. He threw the Baron toward the door as if he were a sack of grain. The nobleman landed in a heap, clutching his shattered wrist and sobbing. Valerius then turned his burning gaze to her uncle. Mr. Finch was trembling, his face the color of ash. As for you, Valerius hissed, you will never trouble her again. You will forget her name. You will forget this house. If you ever think of her, if her name ever forms on your lips, I will know, and I will come for you. He didn't need to touch him. The sheer force of his will, the raw terror he projected, was enough. Her uncle stumbled backward, fell, and then scrambled out the door, fleeing into the storm like the wretch he was. The great doors of the manor slammed shut with a boom that shook the very foundations of the house. Silence descended. Valerius stood in the center of the hall, his chest heaving, the monstrous power slowly receding. The shadows settled, his fangs retracted, the crimson glow in his eyes dimmed to their usual garnet fire. He looked at Sable, his expression vulnerable, worried that what she had seen had terrified her, had shattered the fragile bond between them. But Sable was not afraid. She walked toward him, her steps sure and even on the marble floor. She stopped directly in front of him. She looked up into his ancient, sorrowful eyes. She reached up and gently touched his face, her warm palm against his cool cheek. Thank you, she whispered. His control broke. With a sound that was half groan, half sob, he pulled her into his arms, burying his face in her hair. He held her not with the crushing strength he had just displayed, but with a desperate, trembling tenderness, as if she were the most precious, fragile thing in the universe. I thought I would lose you, he murmured into her hair. I thought you would see the monster and flee. I saw a man in someone he cares for, she replied, her voice muffled against his chest. The only monster I saw today was greed. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. The centuries of grief and solitude were in his eyes, but now something else was there too, a brilliant, blazing hope. Sable, he said, his voice thick with emotion. For 300 years, this house has been a tomb. I have been a ghost within it. But you have filled it with life. You have given me back the past, and in doing so, you have given me a future. You tore my indenture papers, she said softly, a small smile playing on her lips. But you bound me to you more securely than any contract ever could. This time when he leaned in, he did not stop. He kissed her. It was a kiss that held the sorrow of centuries and the hope of a new dawn. It was gentle and yet possessed a desperate, starving intensity. It was the chill of the grave meeting the warmth of the sun, and in that meeting creating something new, something beautiful and impossible. In his kiss, she tasted his loneliness, his grief, his adoration, and she gave him back her own strength, her compassion, her love. When they finally broke apart, the great hall was no longer dark. A stray beam of moonlight had pierced the storm clouds, streaming through a high window to illuminate them in a pool of silver light. The house itself seemed to be breathing again. He knelt before her then, the powerful, ancient vampire king, kneeling on the cold marble floor before the book-mender the world had deemed unremarkable. He took her hand and pressed it to his lips. "Stay with me, Sable," he pleaded. "Not as a guest, not as my restorer, as my equal, my partner, my heart." Tears welled in her eyes, but they were tears of joy. For the first time in her life, she was not just seen, she was cherished. "There is nowhere else I would rather be," she answered. Time passed, marked not by clocks or calendars, but by the turning of restored pages and the slow deepening of their love. Sable was no longer a guest in Blackwood Manor. She was its heart. The dust cloths were removed, the fires burned brightly, and for the first time in memory, they gave off warmth. The staff, who had once looked at her with awe, now looked at her with genuine affection. She had brought life back not only to their master, but to the house itself. The library was her kingdom, and his. They spent their nights there, reading aloud to each other from Iona's journals, not as a memorial to a ghost, but as a celebration of a life that had, in its own way, brought them together. The shrine in the hidden room was dismantled. The objects were lovingly catalogued and stored, not as relics of grief, but as a cherished part of the house's history. One night as they sat before the fire, her head resting on his shoulder, she traced the veins on the back of his hand. "You never age," she said softly. It was not an accusation, just a quiet observation. He grew still, the ever-present shadow of her mortality falling between them. "No," he said, his voice heavy, "I do not." She looked into the fire, at the flames dancing and dying. "I will." He turned her face to his crimson eyes serious and full of love. "We will have all the time you are given. Every moment I will cherish, and when the time comes, if you should wish it, there is a choice we can make together. But only if you wish it. I would love you for a single lifetime, Sable, and count it more of a blessing than an eternity alone." She leaned in and kissed him, a soft, reassuring press of her lips. The choice was there, a promise for a distant future. For now, the life they had, this beautiful, impossible life, was more than enough. She was a mortal woman who had mended the heart of an immortal king. They had all the time in the world. For more stories where quiet compassion conquers centuries of grief and where being truly seen becomes the greatest magic of all, subscribe to Herb Files. So tell me, would you have stayed? Comment where you are listening from tonight. I stay up until my eyes burn to bring you these stories. If this one touched you, do not break my heart. Subscribe and I will see you in the next one.